Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Kawahara, and I am the Executive Director of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. Welcome to this very special seminar titled Climate Change, Health, and the Built Environment, California's Landscape. This is the first of a three-part series that represents a collaboration of partners across the UCLA campus. It is being presented jointly by the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate's Housing as Healthcare Initiative, the UCLA Center for Health Climate Solutions at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health, and the Center for Impact at Anderson, part of the UCLA Anderson School of Management. I applaud all of our campus partners for seeking to address this critically important issue. I would specifically like to acknowledge and thank a few of my colleagues who were instrumental in organizing today's program. Christina Green, Program Manager of Ziman Center's Housing as Healthcare Initiative, Lynn Stoller and Dr. Jonathan Fielding himself at C Solutions, and Professor Maggie Delmas, Bhavna Sivanan, Mia Antonio, and Kelly Chung at Impact at Anderson. They all have been really super delightful and super terrific to work with. So climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is the greatest public health crisis we face today. We need look no further as an example than this summer's heat dome event in the Pacific Northwest, in which hundreds of people fell ill, or died. Wildfires, especially here in the West, are polluting the air with smoke, including in major cities. We all saw those images of San Francisco last year. Extreme heat is lowering ozone level pollution. Drought is leading to food insecurity and contaminated water. Sea level rise is endangering lives and displacing millions across the globe. Floods have left millions homeless and many dead and injured. And climate-sensitive infectious diseases like malaria, dengue, and Zika are presenting in unprecedented locations. Closer to home, you may have followed the recent Los Angeles Times series on the dangers of extreme heat poses to human health. In fact, extreme heat is the deadliest yet least recognized of all our natural disasters. Thankfully, there is more and more scholarship and attention being paid to climate change and health. As an example, at the recent United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, health professionals had a formal and significant seat at the table for the first time. The recently released report of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change issued a code red for the healthy future of our planet and outlining the growing risks to human health climate. Here at UCLA, our colleagues at the UCLA Luskin School for Innovation recently released their report on extreme heat, which among other things identifies the policy and funding gaps in the state's approach to heat preparedness. And how does all this relate to a real estate research center at the business school, you may ask? Well, real estate and the built environment account for 40% of total global carbon output. So any discussion on how to mitigate the impact of climate change needs to include those that develop and build the built environment. Likewise, efforts at adaptation to climate change, with specifically in reference to human health, will need to include everything from urban planning to construction innovation to building safety design. It has been widely established that housing is a social determinant of health, as are the neighborhoods we live in. In a paper written by my friend and UCLA colleague at the Luskin School, Professor Paul Ong, he has asserted that a person's zip code is a better predictor of health status than a person's DNA, which largely speaks to the social inequities endemic to particular neighborhoods and demographics. Any effort to address vital global issues like climate change and health will require an interdisciplinary approach. Too often, I think we work on these issues through the lenses of our own disciplines. This is an effort to expand our thinking and actions beyond our individual silos in academia, science, business, technology, health, and policy. Our goal for today's event is to provide an overview of the current threats to California: extreme heat, wildfire, drought, sea level rise, air quality, and discuss each of these issues with respect to mitigation and the built environment, linked back to health and equity, and laying the groundwork for understanding ways to respond. We have organized what I hope you will find to be an interesting and informative seminar. When we had our prep call last month with our speakers, it became eminently clear that we needed really a week, I think, to cover all the topics, but we certainly will do our best to adequately cover the topic and provide you with an introductory overview. In terms of housekeeping, I'm supposed to tell you that we have reserved time for questions at the end of the program. So please feel free to submit any questions you may have through the Zoom Q&A function, and we will do our very best to get to as many as possible at the end, time permitting. So to get us started, we are extremely fortunate and honored to have a very special guest speaker to deliver our keynote remarks. Dr. Richard Jackson really needs no introduction. He is so preeminent and respected in the field. I could tell you that he is a professor emeritus at the Fielding School of Public Health, where he was department chair in environmental health sciences. A pediatrician by training, he has served in many leadership positions with the State of California Health Department, including the highest as the state health officer. For 9 years, he was director of the CDC's National Center for Environmental Health and received the Presidential Distinguished Service Award. In October 2011, he was elected to the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Scientists. And since 2019, he has co-led their health and climate interest group. There are pages upon pages of accomplishments that I can tell you about Dr. Jackson, but it would literally take all day. In short, they include seminal studies, mentoring students and peers, lifetime achievement awards, medals of honor, congressional testimony, governmental appointments, and even a PBS series. Suffice it to say, Dr. Jackson's contributions to the field are indelible and have profoundly impacted the lives of so many. And with that, I would like to introduce my new buddy, Dr. Richard Jackson.
Hi, Tim, and thank you very much. And you are a good buddy. We have plenty of laughs and good times together, but now you've asked me to do a whole week's condensation into 15 minutes. And by the way, let me know when I've got about 2 minutes left, if you don't mind.
You got it.
I had a good time preparing this in the sense that there was just so much to talk about. And I now have 3 little granddaughters, and I'm thinking a lot locally, and I'm thinking a lot about what I was doing 40 years ago, and the idea that we would have to put wrap around the giant sequoias because of fire threats was beyond my belief 40 and 50 years ago, and to think what's going to happen to my granddaughter's world as they get older. So I'm going to just do a quick view of the California landscape as this goes forward, and let me see if I can. You've always seen this graph, but it's so telling. And when people say, Trump said, well, this isn't real, it'll go away. 10 warmest years on record have occurred just since 2005. And one granddaughter was born in the hottest year on record, and the other granddaughter was born a few years later on the second hottest year in record. So this is very much present. By the way, none of my children who were born in the 80s have ever lived in a colder than average year. So the progress here is really remarkable. And even though I'm being a little home focused as I talk about this, places that we love, whether it's I travel in Alaska or look at the boreal forest areas of Siberia and Northern Europe, and they are the hottest ever on record. In fact, an article just in the last week was about, there's now admixture of the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean because of the ice barriers basically disappearing. And you can see the cold water south and east of Greenland because of the immense runoff of pure frozen water over the last 2 decades in particular. This is from Marshall Burke at Stanford, but he was looking, this is a document on US wildfire increases since 1985. You can see it's going up nationally, and you can see the big jump in California. But what is really interesting to all of us is just how much this fire increase relates to how dry the fuel is, how dry the trees and brush are. And the more desiccated, the drier it becomes, the more flammable. You kind of know that intuitively, but here are the data and powerfully presented on where it's going. And we humans tend to think of this is the way it is now, and we don't think enough about, oh, this is just one frame in a much longer movie that is going in a certain direction. In fact, that's David is an internist, and I'm a pediatrician, and we pediatricians tend to look at children as each visit as one frame in the movie rather than the overall movie. This report just came out. Colleagues at Lawrence Livermore and at Berkeley Lab and elsewhere put it in it. Let's say it shook me up. This complicated Nature in Nature Reviews, a very complex paper, but here's a very simplified version, just looking at our beloved Sierra Nevada and how much water is in the snow in the current up there, and what is projected to happen to the water content in the snows over time. And you can see that, or the amount of how much of that water will actually be snow is this snow water equivalent is the loss is increasing dramatically, so that by the time my granddaughters are 55 years old, we've got an 80% snow water loss in the Sierra that's supplying a large portion of all the drinking water and irrigation water for the state of California. This is huge and will have dramatic impacts on how we live in this country. And the loss of that snow means that the ground is going to absorb at the mountaintops much more of the solar radiation, the heat that's coming down. Trees and other vegetation will begin to grow in those previous iced and cold areas, which puts them at much higher risk. But snow is our best friend in terms of percolation of the earth. And I did a number of books around built environment and health. And one of our enemies is surfaces that direct water away from percolating, penetrating into the earth. And if you want groundwater recharge, it has to go into the earth, and that's how it gets cleaned. The old rule, if trout can swim it, most likely you can drink in it, at least if there's no beavers. And so we really want water to go into the earth, and that's going to stop with the loss of the snowpack. And by the way, snowpack is our best reservoirs. It's very cheap. I'm focused now was on California and the Sierra Nevada, but the Hindu Kush, I didn't know what that was when I was a kid. All the movies talk about the Hindu Kush, but it's this enormous ice pack on the third pole of the planet, North Pole, South Pole, and the Himalayan Hindu Kush ice pack that supplies water to 20 countries and to I wrote it out, 1,650 million people, 1.6 billion people rely on the water, not all year round, but rely on that water. But at least some portions of the year is very necessary. Can you imagine growing rice in India or Bangladesh without the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers? And these are very serious. And think about the dangers of both famine and large-scale movement and immigration. Business people understand this. Smartest people in capitalism, the joke goes, are the people in the reinsurance companies. This is Swiss Re, just talking about impacts. 23 trillion, that's bigger than the entire GDP of the United States. That's about 1/3 of the world GDP as cost impacts of climate. The air getting warmer is, of course, an issue, but the oceans getting warmer is very much an issue. We all know that ocean expansion means we will be flooding areas that we love very much. We all love going to the beaches and being close to them. But it also means like South Jersey is going to be under salt water, as will the Everglades. And it's going to mean much more moisture in the atmosphere because of the hotter oceans and the hotter air blowing over those hotter oceans. This is a very recent slide from NOAA. And I've been watching these slides over time, year by year, and this is the most crowded slide I've seen. This is 2021 billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. And by the way, this is only the first 9 months of 2021. So I fear that it will be even more dense. And Tim already talked about Western wildfires and severe flooding. We're looking at more of this going forward. The Lancet Countdown, and I recommend it very, very strongly for your reading, but I'm now going to confess that I've had it for about a month, and I've read it through 2 or 3 times, but there's a lot there to absorb. It's very powerful. It's the 43 researchers, Renee Salas, who we just got elected to the National Emergency Medicine Physician at Harvard, just got elected to the National Academy of Medicine, was one of the major authors. And all the medical specialties are now saying, this is what we need to worry about. And most physicians are obsessed with COVID, and I fear that COVID's going to be a small inkling of what we're going to be looking at in terms of health threats. Here's 2 quick slides of that very big Lancet Countdown report that's supposed to be for COP26, the event in Glasgow. And very quick takeaway is communities, countries with a low human development index, that means they're not as rich, have much higher impacts and suffer much more from loss of work. And if you're living on subsistence agriculture and your work is getting food for you and your family, to be in one of these low development communities means that you have much less ability to work. And those green blocks in the graph to the right are just how much more the impact is on agriculture, but it also is on construction, manufacturing, and other materials as well. I don't have slides for all of this, but here's what happens in construction. Construction now in Phoenix, Arizona, and by the way, Sacramento is on track to be as hot as Phoenix very, very soon. Construction in Phoenix now largely goes on at night. Imagine the biorhythm problems you have if you're only working at night. And when you lay concrete, it best cures at about 55 degrees. So there's major impacts both on the workers. And here's a line from the head of health and safety for the construction company saying, health impacts are cumulative, they're long-term. And when you have heat stress, the next time you get it, it's amplified, it follows you for your career. And think about if you're a poor farm worker, doesn't speak English, picked up by a labor contractor, barely knows where you're working. And now they're putting lights in the field. So you're exhausted from trying to sleep all day and then trying to work all night because of that's when harvest could be done. I was on a National Academy meeting, and Niall Ferguson, a professor at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, said, well, we shouldn't have to do anything because the Chinese aren't doing very much. And I will tell you that this report just came out in the last day or so. This is the Lancet Countdown for China, and leading Chinese leaders going through the same set of issues for their country. So they're not being squelched to say, this is a threat to this country of 1.2 billion people that work so hard to move out of poverty. This is worldwide. So even though the leaders of the country have refused to commit to COP26 reductions, they've refused publicly. I think privately, there's a lot going on. Excuse me. This is just the impacts of heat deaths in China. And this is public, it comes out from China itself and the public health leaders of China about where they're seeing the most deaths. And of course, the impacts of climate are much more than just heat wave deaths. Here are the big emitters, and it's a busy slide, World Resources Institute slide, but you can see the top 10 are about at red circle, about orange, 2/3 of the emitters worldwide countries. China is about 1/4 of all the emitters, where it is bigger than the US and EU put together. If you add India in, but this is emissions over the last 150 years. And when the Chinese say, wait a minute, you Americans and Europeans benefited from all the fossil fuels you burned for the last 150 years, we're just trying to catch up. I can understand their anxiety, but we're in a very different world from where we were in 1900, for example. The yellow line is US emissions. GT is gigaton, and CO2 equivalence means all the greenhouse gases are turned into a CO2 equivalent. And here's the current emissions. So even though we're saying a good story about, we're going to cut our emissions, we're going to do a lot. Here's US emissions compared to China with all their manufacturing. And a lot of manufacturing in the US have dropped because a lot of it's going on in China and developing countries and the European Union. So the US has got to step up and really get control of our own behavior. I just had this one slide, a number of slides about built environment, but could you think of a more useless way to burn fossil fuels than sitting in traffic on Wilshire Boulevard? 100 years ago, you could get on the red line from UCLA downtown in an hour, and now you can have a Lamborghini or I guess the senator from West Virginia has a Maserati, and he can go from UCLA to downtown in an hour. So we're not making a lot of progress in this regard. This is from an earlier COP report, if you will, and this is a comparison of two cities of 5 million people. They both have about the same population, but one is much larger than the other. Which one do you think has the larger per capita footprint, carbon footprint? And you can see one is 10 times larger than the other. So this is really a palpable touch of the fact that density, quality density, happy density, like you can find in Barcelona, allows people to have good quality of life, but much, much lower carbon emissions. So here are the states in the US and which ones are the big producers. And you know it's going to be Texas and California right up front. Texas has got 10 million fewer people than California, but has almost twice the emissions. Florida, Illinois, and New York each have about 20 million people, but New York has significantly lower emissions than Florida and Illinois. And what's interesting to me is that Florida's got more sunshine than almost anywhere. And why aren't they using a lot more photovoltaics? And they've got good wind and storms as well. These are the emissions from California, and we'll touch on it later, but transportation is the big one. I am thrilled that Pete Buttigieg is now head of transportation. I spent 3 days with him in South Bend, Indiana, as he was redesigning the downtown, turned their one-way streets into two-way streets, put lots more apartments downtown, shops and stores, took the St. Joseph's River and created a kayaking river there where people can go. And it has become far more attractive. He understands that transportation in many ways dictates people's behavior in a city, and quality density means that you really have less carbon footprint per home. California has done a good job on reducing our emissions, although I think we need to take more account of the supply chain, and having 100 ships filled off the Long Beach Harbor filled with finished products. We ought to be counting those finished products and the energy embedded in making all that furniture, equipment, textiles, whatever it is out there, electronics. So we shouldn't be too proud of the fact that our greenhouse gas emissions in California have dropped, although it makes the point to the other states that you don't have to kill your economy by reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. Our population and GDP went up at the same time our greenhouse gas emissions went down. California rightfully has demanded and needed a right to set environmental standards, particularly air pollution standards, more stringent than those of the federal government. Trump got rid of it. I'm pleased that under the Biden administration, it's reconstituted because so much of the important work, whether it's the Cal Enviro screen and others in California, have got to propagate out to the rest of the country, in my opinion, rather than simply seen as a California oddity. This is not going to be an easy battle. Every time I look at various websites that talk about climate, there's always an ad from the gas industry. Exxon for a long time said, and Mobil said, we're one of your friends, don't worry about it. And yet everyone that's had jobs like mine have had private investigators from either the pesticide industry or some of the other industries tailing us because they didn't like what we were saying. And they're very good at secretly hiring very smart people to attack any kind of efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm almost done here, but the important slide, fossil fuel subsidies. This is from the International Monetary Fund. Fossil fuel subsidies, $6 trillion a year. So that's 1/3 of the GDP of the United States is $6 trillion a year. And about 6% of the global GDP as well. And about 92% of it is because we undercharge for the environmental impacts of fossil fuel use. And if we made the cost commensurate to the harm, that would make sense. And if we did stop subsidizing and began to tax much more effectively things that are bad for us, the way we do with alcohol and tobacco, we would ratchet down much more of the carbon emissions into our society. So a couple quick comments closing and thinking about COP26, thinking about, again, of my grandchildren, that there's a very genuine fear in our young people that we are destroying the world and the world they're going to live in. And Greta Thunberg's thundering, really uh, disappointment with COP26, saying it was just a PR event and they were just talking, and the hundreds of thousands of young people showing up and really demanding real change and feeling like they weren't getting it. And there was an explanation of one of the reasons is that these were the planes landing at Davos a year or so ago. 1,500 private flights in and out of Davos to bring the top investors and fossil fuel lobbyists. And that's what happened at COP26. And so finance writers were saying that COP has transformed from environmental ministers, scientists, and advocates, activists to one of business leaders, financiers, and monetary officials. So this model of let's just play golf and enjoy country club living while the world burns is one that I think strikes fear into all of us, but particularly our young people, like, what the hell are you people doing? And this article by Christopher Caldwell, where finance leaders are looking at potentially raising as much as $60 trillion, go for the CalPERS fund, the university funds, the sovereign funds of various nations to take charge, and they're going to fix it all. And maybe they will do a lot of good, but we people in public health, we people that are advocating for the children and for the grandchildren and for our planet need to be as strong as anybody that landed in a private jet, demanding what's going to happen going in the future and speaking to issue of equity and socialization, well-being. Two quick last slides. One is research. This is non-events research in the United States. You can see health research is a big one over the last 40, 50 years. The amount of research that goes into climate health is negligible. You can't even see it on the research diagram related to health in the US, and it's 0.04%. And it's one of the reasons that a number of us, including Howie Frumkin and myself, are continuing to demand a National Center for Climate and Health at NIH. For them to have $40 billion a year for the last 10 years and to put peanuts into climate, the biggest threat to humanity, is beyond me. And so here is my closing comment. And I want to thank Brad Smith for this. I've been reading the history of World War II, a little light reading, the man becomes emeritus. But when you read about the US response to the existential threat of having the Nazis taking over Europe and loss of the South Pacific to the Japanese Empire, the amount of focus in the federal government's leadership. And George C. Marshall was oversaw all of this. Marshall was FDR's advisor, and they thought deeply about logistics and how to really move over time and strategies. Marshall was then the man that turned around and was behind the rebuilding of Europe, because he knew that if we demolished these economies, we'd be back in another war within a few years more. And so thinking about bringing all of our intellectual power, all of our industrial power to confront the existential threat that climate change is where we need to focus right now. This is as important, more important perhaps even than the threat in World War II, and certainly more important than COVID. So with that, let me stop, and I sure hope my grandchildren get to see a giant sequoia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. That was a really great overview. I can tell you, working on a college campus, that anecdotally I've seen more and more of our young students interested in climate change in general. So hopefully that bodes well for the future. And certainly we need to do our best to keep the issue in front of them moving forward. And I hear your point loud and clear about funding. I know there's a lot of funding coming into mitigating climate change. I'm not so sure how much of that is directed specifically towards public health. And I think we need to have a larger slice of the pie there.
And just to stay with that, Tim, we're not supporting a lot of young PhDs, a lot of young docs really want to work on this, and they could do something subspecialized and get funding. They can't get it for this, which is, in my opinion, far more important.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. And then finally, I was thinking that we could engage our own Chancellor Gene Block, with your workers in Arizona. His expertise actually in the lab research is on circadian rhythm. So maybe he would even have something to say about the matter. Who knows?
We have 400,000 farm workers in California, and these poor folks have struggles as it is without turning day for night.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of workers about farm workers and migration and where they're going and how climate change. I mean, there was a group that usually seasonal workers would go up to Oregon for cooler weather, but it's just as hot there as it is in Central Valley. So they're saying, why go? So it's definitely impacting a lot of different things across the globe. So thank you so much. Why don't we now, I can't believe we're like right on time almost, but why don't we move on to our panel discussion, which Dr. Jackson has graciously agreed to join as well. We have a spectacular, expert and passionate group of panelists, each of whom will provide a different cut at the issue. They include, in alphabetical order, we're very egalitarian here at UCLA, Professor Lara Cushing. She's the Jonathan and Karen Fielding Presidential Chair in Health Equity and Associate Professor in Environmental Health Sciences, of course, at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. We have Professor David Eisenman. I think he has a joint appointment at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. We have Dr. Elizabeth Rhodes, who's the Director, Climate Change and Sustainability Program for the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health. And finally, we have Dr. Ryan Vaughn. He's a technical product manager at a group called Jupiter Intelligence. And I remember when Ryan was a starving student here in my office, I probably had to feed him a sandwich every now and again. So good to catch up with Ryan again. So Ryan, since you crunch data and study climate risk across many sectors, both public and private, I thought maybe we could start with you, and you could just tell us a little bit about what Jupiter Intelligence does, what you're thinking about and working on with respect to this particular issue. So Ryan, please.
Hey, thanks, Tim. So Jupiter Intelligence is in the business of providing a look into the future on what all these different climate perils are going to look like across the globe at a very granular scale. I put together a bunch of slides. I don't have time to go through all of them, so I'm going to bounce around and maybe reference them later if there's a direct question. If we go to the next slide. I'll just keep talking. Do I control this?
I think you might.
Whatever.
You go ahead.
There it is.
You're all good. Yep.
Okay, so like the data that comes into these, and just cycle forward kind of slowly, comes from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group set up in the late 80s by the United Nations. Let's pause here for 1 second. I think this is important to understand because it gets kind of glossed over in the media and the articles that get written about climate change and what's going to happen in the future, what's going to happen by 2100, how bad is it going to get. All of the data that is used to make these public declarations about our future come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. They put out these reports. Those reports are called ARs, or assessment reports, and they come with 3 working groups, each one. The one that came out this summer was working group 1 from AR6, which is the 6th time the IPCC has put out one of these reports. Working group 1 is the physical science basis. So that's the description of how temperatures are going to change into the future. And along with that report comes a lot of data that companies like Jupiter can pick up and then refine and improve to make it into a commercially viable product that banks and insurance companies, mining companies, federal regulators, et cetera, can pick up and use to set a well-informed policy. And then there's 2 more reports coming out on adaptation and mitigation efforts, and those are all part of AR6. I just wanted to highlight that it's not fully done yet, and you'll hear IPCC, you'll hear ARs, and then you'll hear GCM. We could go one more slide forward. GCM stands for Global Climate Model. Actually, skip 2 more. This is another important buzzword to know. Global climate models are the models that the climate scientists create that inform the reports that the IPCC rights. They're vastly complicated, and they have a resolution over the globe of about 1 degree latitude longitude, which is roughly 110 kilometers square. So the predictions cover like the state of Florida is one observation in these models generally. And then companies like Jupiter take that and combine it with information about the land surface and other things we know about the way weather works to drill down to get to, say, 90 meter. What's it going to do to that property on the ground? But the data published by the IPCC doesn't quite get to that granular asset level step. And then one more slide I want to highlight before I'll push this forward. If we go forward one more time, I believe. Yeah, so these are called the CMIPs, C-M-I-P. This is another word you might hear tossed around. See, the CMIPs combine all those GCMs in a way that makes them harmonize with one another. So that it takes the scale and the units of the output from all these different models created at different universities by different teams of scientists and combines them together in a way that they can all speak together. And in that way, we're able to create a distribution of possible impacts. What's the 5th percentile? What's the mean? What's the 95th percentile? And understanding that distribution of possible outcomes is also super important because it does tend to vary quite a bit. So I think I'll pause there. So I don't want to run over my 5 minutes. But the point of my talk is going to be, or any questions for me, please ask anything you like, but in particular questions about what does this data for the future actually look like and what can we trust about it?
Thanks so much, Ryan. Yeah, I figured, but did not know there was this whole cottage industry of crunching data and trying to understand climate change and then advise clients, again, both public-private sector, on what they should be thinking about with respect to their own business plans and other things. So that's extremely helpful. So why don't we now turn to Dr. Eisenman, David? Perhaps you could just give, I think you have a couple slides to share with us.
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Tim, for inviting me to talk with you. So first slide, please. Okay, there we are. So, this is a real estate center, and this is the built environment. And so I wanted to make the point that I make sometimes in lectures when I talked about disasters, which is my research, about why heat events don't make the news. Now, why is this important? Well, extreme heat events in cities, what we call heat waves, we also now really call heat events because they can be one day and maybe not a wave of days. So extreme heat events are the leading weather-related killer in the United States and many countries. And that's annually more than the estimated number of deaths from hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, all of which make the news because I would say they make better pictures. You can see destroyed real estate. You can see people out on the street, homeless. You don't see that with heat waves. People die isolated in their overheated apartment, or they die after being brought from the field as an agricultural worker to an emergency room somewhere. And in fact, so this is a heat wave. This is a street in Philadelphia before the heat wave and after the heat wave, making that sort of kind of glib point. But, in Los Angeles, every heat day we have increases the rate of deaths by 8%. And so if we have about 15 deaths normally on any one day in Los Angeles, we estimate that every time there's extreme heat day, there's at least another 2 deaths or 3 deaths. And that's over the entire population. If you actually look in African American and Latino populations, that number doubles. On an extreme heat day, the rate of death in those populations doubles to about 15 or 16% over where it would normally be. And in California, we have seen analyses from Los Angeles Times, for instance, that though only about 600 deaths get recorded as heat-related on death certificates, really, when you look at all the causes, all the medical problems that heat brings, it's probably closer to 4,000 deaths that have happened, for instance, in the decade of 2010 to 2019. So not 600 deaths in that decade, but 4,000 deaths. So we're going to be seeing more frequent heat events. we're going to be seeing heat events that are hotter. They're going to be longer duration, more days. They're going to start earlier in the year, in the spring, and when we're less assimilated, and so they'll be more deadly that way. Let's go on to the next slide. So, a lot of times we hear about a 1 or 2 degree or 2.5 degree increase in mean temperature. And that just doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, the average temperature increasing by 2 degrees doesn't really seem to be, how's that going to be so deadly? Well, this slide shows you how a small change in average temperatures leads to a big change in the amount of people that feel extreme heat. So here's a Bell distribution of temperatures. Extreme heat is all the way to the right. If you shift the curve just 2 points over to the right, the area under the curve that would be in that red and orange zone would increase significantly. And this is an animated slide. It's not animating right now, but you can imagine for yourself the number of more people a number of more days that would be under the curve if you were to be able to shift it over just 2 degrees to the right. Now, this is what I call extreme heat's pyramid of health harms. And I just want to point out that there's a lot more going on with extreme heat than just deaths. And so at the bottom, so this is a pyramid that shows the size of the population affected by extreme heat. And studies have shown all these things. So at the basis, at the very foundation of heat, it impairs our ability to think, right? We are tired, lassitude, fatigue. Studies have shown that in school children who are in schools that are unair conditioned, that they do worse on standardized tests on heat days. We all know the experience of trouble sleeping if we can't get air conditioning at night. So there's common impairments that occur that have significant health and economic and educational effects. That leads to the next level, which is the hidden harms. For instance, these impaired cognitive performances that occur, like we're a little slow, we're a little clumsy, we're not thinking too well. Well, on the workplace, studies from UCLA have shown that this leads to more workplace injuries in, for instance, warehouses, not just for agricultural locations or constructions, but all the big box stores that have their warehouses. Jisung Park has shown this data. Premature births increase when there are heat waves or extreme heat events. Then this leads to the next level. We all know that feeling, sort of what they call hot under the collar. Well, it's been studied. Extreme heat leads to greater aggression. It leads to mood changes, and we see an increase in violence, and we see an increase in suicides linked to extreme heat. And then we only start to get to the top of the pyramid, and these are sort of smaller groups of the population that are affected. There's heat exhaustion and heat stroke, and that's what the coroners put in their birth certificate, in their death certificates. But there are a lot of other reasons that people get sick and die from heat, which is that it causes exacerbations of people's chronic diseases, their asthma, their COPD, their heart disease, their kidney insufficiency that leads to hospitalization and then to a death. And so, this is just making the point that it's really a much, much bigger effect, the health harms of extreme heat. I think that's my last slide.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. That certainly puts a lot into context. It struck me that so many of these folks who die of heat events die indoors, and in California law codified, all homes are required to have heat, but they're not required to have any air conditioning or any cooling mechanism whatsoever. So probably something that we need to revisit on the built environment side. But thank you very much. We'll get back to, I'm sure, a lot of follow-up questions there. So why don't we now turn to another one of my colleagues at UCLA, Professor Lara Cushing, and perhaps you could just share a few thoughts about your work and how it pertains to this subject.
Hi, yes, I'm happy to. It's exciting to be a part of this webinar and participate as a panelist. So thank you for the invitation. I come from the public health perspective. I'm an environmental epidemiologist, and much of my work focuses on issues of environmental justice. So I wanted to focus my comments on the unequal impact of climate change on health and the built environment, and why it's important to make the connections between social inequality and climate change in order to advance health equity. Next slide, please. While we're all vulnerable to the health impacts of climate change, we really have to acknowledge that what's been called the climate gap. The fact that disadvantaged segments of our society, people of color who are on the receiving end of structural racism, the poor will experience greater impacts. And that's true both globally when comparing across countries, as well as within our own countries and communities. So the research shows that people of color and the poor in California are already and will be increasingly experiencing higher mortality and health impacts associated with climate change. And some of the other panelists have already highlighted this, as well as Tim in his opening remarks. In addition, higher levels of exposure to air pollution, which will be getting worse due to climate change. And the exposure levels are already currently unequal with respect to race and class. A widening spending gap as basic needs become more expensive. Low-income households will have to spend more of their income on things like food, water, and energy. And finally, reduced economic activities and opportunities because these populations are overrepresented in sectors that are very vulnerable to climate, like tourism and agriculture. So, the risks of climate change to any one individual are really determined by the three factors in the Venn diagram here on the right: exposure, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. And the built environment interacts with all three of these. So if we return to the example of heat that David was just talking about, localized heat island effects can result from living in a neighborhood without much vegetation and with a lot of heat trapping surfaces like asphalt and concrete, leading to higher temperatures and higher exposures in socially disadvantaged neighborhoods that tend to be less green. Socially disadvantaged populations may also be more vulnerable to the health effects of heat exposure, for example, due to employment or overrepresentation in industries with precarious employment, with few worker protections, for example, piecemeal agricultural work where you don't get paid if you stop to take a break on a hot day. And finally, adaptive capacity refers to things like, access to air conditioning or healthcare to mitigate your exposures or recover from injuries resulting from exposure. So in the next slide, I wanted to touch on two examples from my own research. The first is a study here looking at the risk of preterm birth during extreme heat events. Preterm birth refers to a baby being born too soon, so prior to 37 weeks of pregnancy, and is a primary predictor of infant mortality, but can also have lifelong health implications that are more severe the earlier you're born. So this is work where we looked over a 5-year time period that included a landmark heat wave and it was in Houston, Texas, but similar findings have been found by other researchers looking in California. So what this graph shows is that there was a 15% higher risk of preterm birth following an extremely hot day when compared to non-extremely hot days, looking across the entire population. But if you go to the next slide, these other dots here on the graph represent, we've split the population according to the neighborhood they live in. And we found that risks were twice as high among pregnant people that lived in segregated neighborhoods with the highest concentrations of people of color living in poverty. So again, here, the impacts are not felt equally across the population. Next slide. The second body of work I wanted to share is a collaboration between UCLA, UC Berkeley, Climate Central, and several California-based community partners, a project we call Toxic Tides. And here we've estimated the risks of future flood events at over 10,000 sites that use, emit, or store hazardous chemicals in low-lying areas of California. Flood events that are due to sea level rise associated with climate change. So we looked at a wide variety of sites that might release hazardous substances during a flood event, including things like hazardous waste disposal and cleanup sites, refineries, sewage treatment plants. And we also sought to understand who would be most impacted by looking at what are the populations that live nearby. Next slide. What we found was that over 400 sites are at risk of increased flooding across the sectors shown in the pie chart on the right, with the San Francisco Bay Area and Southern California having some of the highest concentrations of these sites, as shown in the map on the left. And moreover, we found that disadvantaged communities, as you might expect, were disproportionately impacted. So on the next slide, we show that using the CalEnviro screen tool that was mentioned earlier to define disadvantaged communities, we found they were 6 times more likely to live near an at-risk site within 1 kilometer. And if you go to the next slide, we also found that various indicators of population vulnerability were higher near at-risk sites, including lower levels of voter turnout as an indicator of civic engagement, rates of home ownership, the proportion of residents that are people of color or live in a linguistically isolated household where no one speaks English, and where communication during a disastrous event might be more difficult. Next slide. These data were released through a web tool earlier this morning, actually, where you can find out more information about these sites and the neighborhoods at risk here. Last slide, please. So the good news amidst all this doom and gloom is that hopefully as we begin to aggressively reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, those climate actions will lead us to live healthier lives. So the public health benefits really outweigh the costs of adopting ambitious climate mitigation strategies. We know that now. And greenhouse gas reductions will save millions of lives globally, as I said, through things like better air quality, improved diets and nutrition, people getting more physical activity, getting out of their cars. So, the good news here is that we do know what needs to be done and how to transition to a fossil fuel economy. And as we hopefully begin to do that, we will be reaping public health benefits. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lara. Ed, I would imagine too that, obviously we just are hopefully at the tail end of a global pandemic with COVID. COVID obviously laid bare some of these inequities as well. And there's probably a correlation between the disparate outcomes of people from COVID, as will be the case with climate, unfortunately, but interesting correlation to look at. So why don't we now turn to Elizabeth Rhodes. Interesting perspective in that she is at a public health agency with the county. I'm really interested in hearing what you're up to, what the county's thinking about, and what our policymakers are thinking about with respect to this issue.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. So yes, my name's Elizabeth, and I'm our program director for the climate change program at the LA County Department of Public Health. I've been here for about 7.5 years, and as Tim mentioned, I'll talk about some of what we do, our concerns, and some examples of some on-the-ground projects that we've done recently. Next slide. So I want to just start by orienting you to how the Department of Public Health, which is one of the largest health departments in the country, is addressing the health impacts of climate change. Our mission really is to protect LA County residents, especially communities of color and low-income communities, from climate impacts by promoting actions that slow climate change and build resilience. And we've heard a lot about those climate impacts. Dr. Ziman talking about the pyramid of health harms related to extreme heat, for example, and Dr. Cushing talking about preterm births and other impacts. And so thinking about how do we put in place strategies, both related to the built environment and other strategies that help protect people from those harms. Next slide. So a lot of what we do in our program is we provide public health expertise to climate change decision-making that's happening across the county. So we have a lot of stakeholders and partner agencies working on climate change, and it's important to have that health perspective in there for reasons I'll also cover in a minute. We also, we are the health department that's responsible for the health and well-being of the 10 million residents of LA County. So also integrating climate considerations into our own public health decision-making is really critical as well. And that's what we work on here too. Next slide. So we work in a variety of ways, but I think it's really important to think about why, I think I'm still waiting for that, there we go, why we want a public health frame. And I think a lot, the previous speakers have really touched on that, on the fact that climate change is having and will continue to have significant public health impacts. And it's our responsibility, as I talked about, to enact strategies that protect the public from those impacts. It's also important to talk about climate change from the health perspective, because research shows us that framing climate change in the context of health is the most effective way to help people support climate solutions. I think that's because we hear a lot about environmental impacts, and especially in the past, we hear a lot about polar bears, and what people respond to are things that affect them personally, are immediate to them and their lives. And so a lot of what we do is explain that explain the health impacts of climate change, and also, as some of the previous speakers touched on, the health benefits of action. So we get immediate public health benefits when we take action on climate change. Next slide. So I'll wait for that slide to come up so that I can remember what it is. So one of the projects that I kind of wanted to talk about today is how we're leveraging our resources as a county department to on the ground built environment work. So we've talked about climate impacts. A lot of the speakers touched on extreme heat. It's one of the major climate impacts. We've had record-breaking heat waves in the last few years. Our Labor Day 2020 heat wave coincided with a massive wildfire. We saw increased mortality, increased emergency room visits during that heat wave. So thinking about how do we prepare our built environment for extreme heat? And there are a number of things we can do related to that. We can have cool surfaces like cool roofs and cool pavements. We can increase our tree canopy cover as well. So one of the projects I wanted to talk about is focused on increasing our tree canopy cover in neighborhoods that have low tree canopy, and these are typically low-income communities and communities of color. And this was a project led by the Department of Public Health, and really a great example of how the county used an innovative approach to overcome some of the obstacles that we faced when working to increase tree canopy cover. We collaborated with Public Works, the San Gabriel Valley Conservation Corps, and other community partners to plant 2,000 trees in some underserved areas. And the issue that we kind of overcame here is that trees require resident approval. It requires resident approval to plant a tree in the parkway in front of a resident's home. A resident needs to agree to water and care for the tree. And some residents historically have opted out of trees despite the many benefits of them because of concerns about roots and debris and their water use. So we implemented a grassroots public education and outreach component in our tree planting to improve tree acceptance and survival and educate the community about the benefits of trees. And this involved training local at-risk young people on how to conduct this education and outreach. We also, helped teach them kind of how to talk to residents about the benefits of trees, and there were post planting follow-ups with residents as well. Next slide. And then also trained them, providing job and life skills, and they were able to get community service hours through that project. Next slide. So all of this really falls under the broad umbrella of the LA County Sustainability Plan. And this is the county's first ever sustainability plan, and we think it's one of the most ambitious sustainability plans in the country. This was adopted in 2019. It includes goals, strategies, and over 150 actions. And this is the organizing framework for all of our sustainability work, including all of the important built environment work, as I talked about, trees, cool roofs, cool pavements, all of our urban heat island reduction activities that we're working on as well. So thanks to Lynn for putting the link in the chat, and I encourage everyone to check that out. I think that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's interesting. I've recently seen a heat map of a tree canopy heat island effects in urban areas in LA. And if you literally take the red line maps from back in the day, you will see that there's still to this day a direct correlation between neighborhoods that were redlined and lack of tree canopy, and then obviously the heat island effects. So
absolutely, it's very striking, and that's I think, as you were talking about and others were talking about, that's why we need to be implementing focused interventions that help address those historical inequities,
of course,
that have become current. Yeah.
Of course. So as I suspected, we're running short of time here. So I'd like to ask a follow-up question of each of the panelists, and then we'll try to reserve the rest of the time for Q&A. And there's a number of questions in the chat, but David, I wanted to come to you. You're so the clinician, the practicing physician on the panel. Just curious how you may have seen this how do these patients present to you, and do you have any anecdotal stories, and maybe a little bit more about the mental implications? We talk a lot about the physical effects, but the mental health aspect of it as well.
Yeah, well, there was a question in the text in the Q&A box that I think I'm going to use to orient my answer, which is how do we make this climate change real to people? So I do that in my office as much as possible. And I'll tell you the most common scenario that I really enjoy having a chance to do is climate change is leading to worse seasonal allergies. Allergic rhinitis, which is seasonal allergies, is now has greater period of time that it occurs as the spring and fall peak is extended, comes earlier, it's more intense, and it's geographically spread further. So people are coming to me and saying, this is the worst allergy season I've ever had. I never used to have it. I used to have it on the East Coast. Now I moved to California, it was gone. Now it's here again. And I say to them, this is climate change. You are experiencing climate change. And so this goes to Elizabeth's point, which is when I make that connection that it's harming their health now. And seasonal allergies really do harm your health. I mean, it's very hard to do your work when you're all stuffed up and crusty-eyed. So it makes the point that it's already harming their health. And it's a real thing, and it's just beginning to affect us. And so it becomes an opportunity for me to talk to them about, you should really think about how, for instance, you might respond to this. And we talk about the various ways that they can make some change to help reduce the climate change. In terms of mental health, I think one of the areas that I'm interested in is is wildfires. You mentioned the smoke event, the smoke in the 2020 wildfires. Right now, wildfires are happening more often. They're more fire. They're lasting longer. And the smoke is much more impactful than the flames. We see television pictures of houses going up in flames. But as we all know, from the summer of 2020, we were locked in our homes here in Los Angeles from fires hundreds of miles away. And this is going to become a more frequent occurrence where you have these more frequent and more persistent fires putting out smoke everywhere in the summer mainly, and forcing us to go indoors. And I don't know about you, but for me, it felt like the COVID lockdown again. I couldn't go outdoors. I was isolated from my friends. I couldn't do social activities. It was depressing. And there's some research on this. And so the question of how are these wildfires and the smoke consequence of them going to create more mood problems for all of us and change our social lives, change lots of things in our lives. That's really where I'm very interested in going in my work.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's all incredibly important. Lara maybe will address this too, but I mean, there's also just the issue of heat and children's ability to learn in school. We see that their cognitive abilities go way down when they're in environments where they're in extreme heat and the like. But why don't we turn to Lara on that particular issue? And then also, as we think about building the built environment, we know we should probably stay away from building homes next to freeways and things like that. We have the new infrastructure bill that's coming down. There's going to be a lot of new investment there. Certainly, there has been a lot of social injustice with respect to freeways and infrastructure in the past. I think about, in the 60s, there was a freeway that was proposed to go through Beverly Hills, if any of you remembered that, to connect the 101 and the 405. Never got built because they wanted to cut right through a wealthy neighborhood. Of course, there was lots of objections and it never got done. Yet when they wanted to find a place to connect 4 freeways, well, you went to the East LA interchange, and 4 major freeways come together in East Los Angeles, Boyle Heights. And I've heard people say, well, why would you have built that school next to that freeway? And what people don't understand is, no, the school was already there, and then the freeway was built around them. So what should we be thinking about where we build, proximity of homes to, say, refineries and things like that, or the WUI? Any comments there?
Yeah, well, you're bringing up, I think, some really tough and thorny issues. Yeah. I try to end my remarks on the positive note and how, as we take action against climate, we can.
Oh, that's my fault. Sorry.
No. But I'm glad you brought it up because, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture here. And we do know, historically, we haven't done a great job in terms of addressing social inequalities when citing infrastructure, for example. So I really do think this cross-sectoral dialogue, and we need to not be thinking in silos here, because there can be a lot of also inequitable outcomes from how we address climate change. And we know, and competing interests. So we know we're in a, extreme affordable housing crisis in this state, and there's a real need for affordable housing. But it should, we also know it shouldn't be built on, on top of hazardous waste sites or sites at risk of flooding due to sea level rise, et cetera, or near some of these emitting facilities that pollute. So, and same thing, with the efforts to green neighborhoods. I saw a question or comment about, but there's water scarcity at the same time. We're in a drought, right? And we also know that sometimes efforts like that can have unintended consequences, where you plant some trees and suddenly the neighborhood becomes very desirable, becomes subject to gentrification, and the very people we were attempting to, we're hoping would benefit, get pushed out of the neighborhood. So I do think we need to grapple and think proactively about unintended consequences and really prioritize our efforts in ways that will benefit the most impacted populations first and foremost, whether it's around building new infrastructure or building new housing and where it goes. That needs to be the priority, because until climate resilience, reaches those that need it most, none of us will be resilient to climate change.
Yeah, your comments and answer about gentrification is an interesting one, which we think about a lot in the real estate world. And I've met with the anti-gentrification folks in Boyle Heights, for example, and they are suggesting going out of their way not to beautify their neighborhoods at the risk of gentrifiers coming in. So it's obviously a very complicated issue. Elizabeth, just turning to you briefly, we know that obviously certain populations are more vulnerable than others with respect to the aging population, youth, people with compromised immune systems. Have you identified these specific at-risk groups and have sort of specific mitigation plans to address them?
So one of the things, and I think Aaron actually put this in a Q&A as well, is related to the that we've done this in the climate vulnerability assessment that the county just released. So the county underwent about a year-long process to conduct a vulnerability assessment that identifies the components of vulnerability, what makes people at risk for particular climate impacts. These include everything from age to income, linguistic isolation, access to a vehicle. People who are dependent on electricity for medical devices. There's all kinds of factors. I believe we include 29 indicators of sensitivity to climate impacts. And then the climate vulnerability assessment reviews climate impacts like extreme heat and wildfires, for example, as we've been discussing here, and overlays exposure to those impacts with sensitivity factors like as I just mentioned. And it's very difficult to reach everyone who's vulnerable. There are so many ways that people are vulnerable to climate change. We have a huge county. So, in our department, we do various things to kind of communicate and build awareness about climate risks. We educate the general public through, social media and traditional media. With particular at-risk communities, we have partnerships with community groups that represent and serve at-risk communities. We've also done some small amount of work educating physicians about how they can talk to their patients about risk factors, like Dr. Eisenman talked about. So we do various work in that area. I think I'll probably take too long to go into everything we do, but that's a no.
Yeah, I think the education and outreach, kind of PSA component is important as well. Like with other natural disaster, there are alerts we know ahead of time. Hurricanes are named and we know they're on their way, and we don't name heat events per se, although I know that Spain has started to do that, and there's been some proposals to do that even here.
Yeah, there's some
really
interest
important.
in that.
Dr. Jackson, don't worry, I see your hand. You're going to get the last word, but before that, I would let me go to Ryan and just say that we're sort of California specific here. You've crunched all the data. What are the sort of prioritization of these natural disasters? Is heat the most important thing? Is it wildfire that's impacting, the sort of public-private sector clients that you see?
I think you've kind of answered the question in asking of it. The impacts are going to vary a lot by region and by
geography. Yep.
Yeah, and I think the focus on sea level rise early on in communication about the climate crisis did a disservice to our ability to adapt to the most clear and present threats. Because as you mentioned, heat and wildfire are by far the biggest risk to the LA area and California in general, whereas sea level rise is a much lower risk to us than it is the East Coast.
Yeah.
So being able to take a regional view, focus on what's important to your region and getting the right data that has the right granularity to answer your questions is the most important. So there's no one answer to that.
Right. Great. Thank you. Okay. So to end this panel portion of the program, why don't we just let Dr. Jackson talk about whatever he wants to talk about based on what he's heard.
Uh-oh. Couple quick comments. One is most Americans don't know what the National Environmental Policy Act is, but it goes way back, and it's the origin of the environmental impact assessments. In California, we had our own version of EIRs. But over time, it has devolved into a specialty of a bunch of technocrats using computer programs, and they'll give you 1,000 pages, but they don't capture human health impacts adequately. And as we look at some complicated and thorny questions, and I'm just going to use the example of where do you put schools? And Angelo Bellomo, when he was in the county health department, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And you all know there's a law that says you can't put them within 300 yards or whatever it is of a freeway. Well, I'm going to tell you the truth. I want schools near bus stops and transit centers. I do want kids to be able to use public transportation. Kids ought to be able to leave school when they're done with an after-school activity. Some of the most important stuff at school is the after-school activity. That's when they make friends. And particularly around interracial issues, they tend not to make friends sitting in the lunchroom. It's the activities that really make that go forward. And you do walk more. And, New York kids don't have school buses. New York City kids, they take the subway, and they've learned how to deal with, sometimes fairly disgusting people in that confrontation with the real world. But the other point, and David brought it up, I will be honest, I changed the filter in my bedroom air filter yesterday because my allergies in the fall are really giving me a hard time. And by the way, I bought the filter for COVID and the smoke that we've had locally. But, thinking about solutions that solve multiple problems is a good one. Just to finish the conversation on impact assessments, everything we do everything in medicine, for example, has a negative aspect to it. Every drug has an adverse effect if we look closely enough. Surgery, of course, can have adverse effects. And we're always trying to optimize. And I think approaching these big issues, how do we optimize in the difficult situation we're in, whether it's air quality, COVID, obesity, lack of walking, bad housing, and putting in trees. And so I would love to see, and Jonathan Fielding has been very much embraced of this, I'd love to see a much more powerful embrace of health impact assessment, looking for the most positive outcome. None are perfect, but the most positive outcomes.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that was all just incredibly important information and provides the audience with a much greater understanding of the issues. So with the time left we have, why don't we move to some questions now? I know there are a number of questions in the Q&A function, and I believe my colleague Lynn Stoller is going to come on and read some of those, and then we'll get them directed to the right people to answer. Lynn.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So, I know that we have a really great interdisciplinary team here. And one of the questions that I think really drew my attention, it was really rather a comment. And Elizabeth, I think this would be a great fit for you. It talks about how the health sector is consistently being discussed as finally at the table, especially with this year's COP and within climate change spaces more generally. Can you talk about how public health has historically been involved? How is the Department of Public Health growing its presence? How is it investing in this field? And then what would you like to see to help empower public health professionals to become more involved, even within the current system?
Sure. And I think, is that the comment that also concluded with, we need more funding for public health,
Yes.
which I completely agree with. I think there is the fact that public health has been at the table for some time, but I think we're still doing the hard work of trying to educate decision makers about what it is that, for example, in my case, what local health departments can do and could be doing with more resources to address those health impacts. I think we still do face, I think, as maybe the commenters are speaking to, a bit of confusion about what it is that a local public health agency or a public health nonprofit or a state health department would be doing around climate change. And so I think that is also where the funding disconnect comes from, is that a lot of the thinking around funding for climate change is around infrastructure and things that people see as more tangible rather than programs or policies that would address some of those health impacts. We have needs in data. I would like to see us doing more modeling and projecting the health impacts of climate change, improving our surveillance of health outcomes, like for extreme heat. We have needs in messaging, related to Tim's question. There's so much more we could do in terms of warnings for heat risk communications, awareness campaigns, leveraging like home visiting agencies that already interact with people to help identify and provide resources for people. So I think there's a whole number of things a whole host of things that the public health sector would be doing if we were better resourced. And that one of our tasks is really making that case to legislators, to decision makers at the state and federal level about where we need to go. And one of the challenges is also that we really need an agreed framework, I think, at the state level about what are the priorities in protecting public health and how are we all going to get there, particularly as health agencies. But I really appreciated that comment. So thanks.
Thank you. Next question, Lynn.
Great. So there were several questions on the real estate side, Tim, that I'm actually going to ask of you. The first has to do with how real estate, or how the Ziman Center has approached categorizing the forms and variables associated with housing and emissions and waste management. There were some clarifying points on here, but I had seen that you had marked that for yourself.
I did. Yeah, I saw the question. I wasn't sure exactly what it was asking, but but I can say that there are, there's been an effort to have like net zero homes, for example, plug-ins in all the garages for electric vehicles. I know that there's been a hard look at different material usage. So, reflective materials for roofing, using a different mix of concrete, for example, has been explored, all things that can address, heat, but also even on the wildfire side, using apparently metal roofs are really excellent. They perform well in wildfire zones. So as they build paradise back again, I hope that they are using metal roofs and eliminating rain gutters, which act like kindling for fires as well. And then of course, there's been on the policy and zoning side, there's been a lot of efforts to build what we call transit-oriented development. So obviously, with the hope of getting people out of their cars, there's been lots of legislation coming down to limit what we call VMT, or vehicle miles traveled. So there has been, sort of on a technical material use, even cutting down, more efficiencies in the construction process, because some of those vehicles and machines that are being used to build our buildings are also emitting carbon. So not just the end product being more efficient, but also the way we do construction management here. Things like modular, where maybe they're built in another location, they're just sort of slapped together on site, and reduces a lot of the construction carbon that would otherwise take place. And then there are even some of our major home builders like KB and others are now putting energy efficient stickers on their homes, just as the way they are with cars, where you can look at, miles per gallon on a car. Well, now you can see the efficiency in buildings. Obviously, lots of programs with solar rebates, things like that, groundwater recapture. So people are definitely working on it, materially on the construction side. But Ryan has his hand up. Maybe he has something to add.
Yeah, I'm going to switch my hat from my Jupiter Intelligence employee hat.
Well, your house is a net zero greenhouse.
But before that, I've been a climate activist for years. Yeah. And I wanted to highlight a group called the National Building Electrification Coalition that's involved in pushing for electrification standards in buildings and cities all throughout the country. And they're having a lot of successes in California. So if you're interested in pushing for better building standards, that's a great group to look up.
Yeah, I've just literally this week worked with another group, LA Buildings Challenge, Better Buildings Challenge, Sustento Group, and a group called Lara that's going to try to start a green bank to basically retrofit buildings, multifamily, commercial, single family homes, try to, retrofit to electric and get gas out. So there's a big move and effort to do that as well.
There's a really exciting company called Block Power that's doing that on the private side.
I've seen them too. So yes, there are definitely efforts in that regard. Lynn, next question.
Tim, can I just cut us all on that one?
Absolutely.
It's really important for this utility portion to underground the utilities because after the big fires in Oakland, Berkeley, they undergrounded them. And here where I live, they'll rip the streets up and put in electrical, and then they'll rip the streets up and put in water. And then they'll separately, a different company will rip them up for gas. And there has to be some real leadership because that's very expensive and really a threat in fires and earthquakes to not have it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this effort at Electrification Retrofitting in LA is a program with LADWP. And of course, up where you are, PG&E is having all sorts of terrible problems with fires and lawsuits and everything else. So yeah, acutely aware. Lynn.
Okay. There was one question that I just want to mention a resource for asking about what is the state doing. The state did just release its draft California adaptation strategy. So you can actually publicly access that, and that'll summarize all of the different programs that the state is currently funding and or is planning to fund. And now I just want to also make a really quick plug based off of that discussion. There's a lot of questions asking about like, what are the new technologies and the new solutions that we can implement? That's what our entire second event in this series is about. So you'll be able to hear more about those solutions for a full hour next time. I do want to highlight, there were a couple of questions asking, what should I do to get involved? How can I be a part of the solution in my community and as an individual? We've seen that historically climate calls to action have been really around individual consumption. And at C Solutions, we try to send a different message around influencing the systems and the communities at large. So I'm just going to leave that sort of open for whoever would like to jump into that.
I saw David answer the same question that I did on the chat. My answer to that is to vote for climate being the #1 issue in your voting agenda, or go run for city council.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the biggest impacts of COVID has been depression, people being isolated and the rest. And depression, solastalgia is one of the pains that is coming out of the fear and anxiety around climate. And the only, you could take drugs for moderate to severe depression, but for the kind of depression we're talking about, people have to be engaged. It's the socialization and the personal engagement is the best therapy as we're facing all of this, whether it's COVID or anything else, climate.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question, Lynn.
Okay, so I guess the final question here would be, so there was a question and some debate in the chat around public health prevention, right? And there was this issue of adaptation and mitigation and co-benefits. David, do you maybe want to take a crack at sort of differentiating between those and how we can capitalize on the benefits there?
Yeah, so it's been a problematic distinction for many because the field really focused for a long time on climate change mitigation, which meant mitigating the amount of CO2, reducing the amount of CO2 that was going into the atmosphere and reducing the climate change that was going to occur. And the idea of adaptation, which is like, let's get ready for this and prepare for the disasters, was felt to be like throwing in the towel. In public health, we've always felt that was a false dichotomy. You had to help people now. Yes, we have to prevent it from getting worse, but people are suffering now. And I think the field broadly of climate change is starting to recognize that, to say climate change, mitigation, and adaptation in one breath. The part about co-benefits is really essential. And I think, others have touched on this, but the things that, the idea that where we live is a stronger determinant of our health outcomes than almost anything else. And so I can look out my window and I see greenery, and that brings my cortisol down and my blood pressure down and reduces my risk of depression. I can go outside and I can run and I can exercise there and I can breathe good air. And that's a benefit I'm getting all the time. Well, from a climate change point of view, the more greenery we could put, the more CO2 would be absorbed by the plants. And so we'd be reducing CO2 emissions. So, a simple thing like putting in more trees, more greenery, more parks, it's a co-benefit, which is a jargon, but it's right away giving us a health benefit. And it's both mitigating climate change and helping us extreme event in adaptation, right? Because now I have shade from those trees.
Absolutely. Great. Well, listen, we are a couple minutes beyond time. As I said in my opening remarks, it'd be impossible to cover everything. There's just so much here. We do have subsequent programmings, but first and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Jackson for the keynote remarks, and I want to thank all the panelists. This was a fantastic conversation. You all brought so much to it. I learned a lot myself, so thank you for making time to be part of this program. I would like to the audience, as we mentioned, this is a three-part series. So the next will focus, as we mentioned, on community resilience and adaptation. So specific adaptation strategies that we need to deploy. And that will be sometime in the winter, probably around February. And then we're gonna, the third and final in the series will be on climate mitigation and displacement. And that'll be sometime in the spring. Also wanted to mention that tomorrow at 11:30, our partners Impact at Anderson is hosting what they call a high impact tea webinar on COP26 and climate regulation, featuring Mary Nichols. Many of you know her, former chairwoman of the California Air Resources Board. I believe they're putting the information in the chat for sign up. And then also to keep up with Sea Solutions, the good work they're doing, to get on their newsletter list. I would encourage you to visit their website, healthyclimatesolutions.org. And with that, I thank everybody, the audience, for joining us. I thank, again, the panelists. I think this was a really terrific conversation. Look forward to having more in the future. And everybody, please have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your good hosting, Tim. Great job.
Welcome. Yep.